MLK Day is a day to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. for his sacrifice and for everything that he did to be able to help people connect with everyone and so that everyone can have a fair chance at life.
To talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, we have to talk about the man, talk about who he was. And he has become very important to me in my adult life. When I was a kid, I learned about Dr. King, as all kids do. We go to school. I was at a school where we did assemblies every February for Black History Month. And Dr. King was always discussed. Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman were always discussed as important figures. But for me, it wasn't till I graduated from college and went to become a teacher on the west side of Chicago that I realized that Dr. King's stories aren't children's stories. And his life was actually something that had a lot of intensity to it. So, as a kid, I learned that Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech, that he worked to end legalized segregation and help for voting rights.
It's a great time of reflection. I believe that society as a whole felt that he was a man of great impact to give him a day. And I personally believe that God raised him up for such a time that he lived in, and we see that it continues through time. His work is transcendent. Time didn't keep it bound, and with some of the most recent activities against African Americans, some of the injustices that we could see that his way of going about it is still effective. The peaceful manner that he took is still effective. That it's not about just reacting in anger, but it's by processing what's actually happening and taking practical steps through the lens of love. I also believe that, him being a Baptist pastor influenced the way that he decided or thought and processed to handle the racism, injustices, inequality that took place in his time, and can serve as a great platform for ministry majors as myself. I am a pastoral ministry major, and when I ask myself as an African American man, how can I be effective? How can I impact society? Is it all about just the Bible, or is it social issues? Can I bring those two together? And I look at Dr. King and how he stood up as a voice, as an influence, as a role model that I could follow after. So I feel like the day of MLK means a lot to me. I can learn a lot from his speeches, the way he conducts himself.
I think for a lot of us, we were first taught about MLK in school, and you are taught the three main things: the I Dreamed the Dream speech, that he was a pastor, and that he was killed. And then there wasn't much information in between that. And so as I got older and started being mentored by an incredible woman who does a lot of racial reconciliation work in the church and does a lot of training with pastors, she uses a lot of MLK quotes and letters in her training. And through that, I learned a lot more about his work and have a deeper appreciation for what he did. And I think specifically of a letter that he wrote while he was in Birmingham jail. A quote he says in the letter is, "We need to repent not only for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but of the appalling silence of good people." And I think as Christians, that is something that really should speak to us in a way that kind of makes us move and take action. The appalling silence of good people. I know that definitely calls me out. And it's one thing to say I love people no matter what their color of their skin or their culture or their beliefs, but it's another thing to be the actual hands and feet of Jesus Christ. And I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. definitely was a representation of that. And as Christians, we need to repent for the appalling silence that we've had and start taking action the same way that he did.
MLK Day matters to me because it honors the legacy of a great man. This man went through harassment, he was threatened, he was beaten, he was jailed 29 times, just not for freedom for certain cultures, but for freedom for all.
So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is more important to me now than he was when he was alive. I was a child when he was assassinated. I remember the morning that we heard the news, and we all knew it. But I was pretty young then and wasn't aware of the racial injustice in this country at the time, and I was too young to really appreciate well enough his importance. But subsequent to that, reading him after the fact, he became more and more important to me. And in truth, this year, I have longed for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To be present in our world. His birthday was January 15th, 3 days ago. He would have been 92, and it would have been incredible, as far as I'm concerned, to have him speaking into the events of this entire year. So what he means to me is I wish he were still here.
MLK Day to me, it's kind of like a day of remembrance, just to remember the hard-fought battle that people, not just MLK, but like Rosa Parks and others who've come before me, just to kind of bring together a more true America, a more free America.
Well, I think because of my age, it doesn't mean quite as much as it might to somebody younger, but I think every year that it comes up, it spurs me to think about who he was and what he wants to accomplish, or for us to accomplish.
Personally, I really love how Martin Luther King Jr. led with peace and how Jesus was the forefront of his movements. And because of that, like, it was successful and we got a lot of things done because of that. Because it wasn't just about pushing his own agenda, but it was about wondering what and considering what Jesus would want to do within the movement. And because of that, we have come a long way from what happened about 60 years ago.
So because of this year, I reacquainted myself with Dr. King's writings, and I have listened to his speeches again. And everybody is aware. If people know of him, they know of his "I Have a Dream" speech on the Washington Mall, and I have listened to that again. But people who are superficially aware of him aren't aware of his other writings, his books, and I have been rereading those in an attempt to help me understand this year and guide me. And I have been over again impressed with his compassion, with his civility, with him as a model of Christian leadership. I appreciate the fact that he was a pastor in the Baptist church, and I appreciate that what formed his vision was a biblical vision of justice, and that he was every bit as aware of the danger of injustice for both the oppressed and the oppressor, and his continual call back for people to love. And I have appreciated again his call to nonviolent protest, his understanding that if injustices weren't rectified, violence was a possibility, but that he never chose violence. He thought violence compromised the moral argument that was being made. And it was ironic, tragic, that the reason he was in Memphis to speak was because a strike of sanitation workers in Memphis had gotten violent. And he flew to Memphis from Atlanta to call them back to his 6 principles of nonviolent protest.
When I I looked at some of his clips, and just how he moved without fear. I think fear is something that can cripple individuals, and fear is something that through the strength of God and His Word, I want to conquer. I have been conquering. Sometimes when I feel like I can't do something, I do it anyways. And when I look at the life of Dr. King, his life was being threatened, but that didn't stop him. There was numerous attempts to take his life. I remember in a clip that I watched, he said that he was leaving a meeting or a previous engagement, and a lady walked up to him and asked him, "Are you Dr. King?" And he said yes, and he just felt a sharp pain in his chest, and he was stabbed. And there was a clip entitled, I'm glad I did not sneeze. And I'm glad he did not sneeze. And he talked about how he received letters from numerous folks with high standards in society. But the one letter that he remembered was a young white girl from high school that said, basically, "I'm glad he did not sneeze." And that's just telling me that regardless of the time that we're living in, the date, there's always things that can make us be afraid. But he was not afraid to die. He was not afraid to lay down his life for what he believed in. He was not afraid to lay down his life for the people he believed in and the dream that he had for America.
When I became a teacher, I walked into my school. On the first day I walked into the school on the west side of the city, I walked up the stairs, these big, ominous stairs, and I walk in, and there's these huge, on butcher paper, this huge word that says, "King is the man." And I didn't know that much about his life, and I just sort of had this kind of sarcastic thought, like, oh, that's subtle. And it took me a long time to realize just what a big deal he was. That was in March of 2003 that I went into that school to become a teacher. And for the rest of the year, there were all of these homages, all of these ceremonies to recognize the work of Dr. King. And at the end of that school year, I decided I need to educate myself. I need to find out, for myself, why he's such a big deal in this place. And so I found this book, The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. It's an interesting book because he actually never wrote an autobiography, but it's all of his work compiled by an editor. So all of this is in Dr. King's words, and it gives you a real sense of the life of this man and the urgency of this man. One thing I knew about Dr. King going into reading this book is that he was a nonviolent activist. And what I didn't realize about Dr. King is that he wasn't a nonviolent activist because he was a sissy or because he was scared of getting hurt. He was using nonviolence because he knew that was the only thing that would work. It was a tactic. It was a tactic that he knew would end in his own physical pain, and ultimately it ended in his death. It ended in his martyrdom. So reading this book was a huge experience for me. And the funny thing was, after I finished reading the book, I went back to my students. My students all had disabilities. I was a special ed teacher. They all had disabilities. And I said, okay, guys, I'm going to teach you about Dr. King. And the little girl raised her hand, and she spouted off his birth date and his death date right away, like they were scriptural references for her. And she just listed facts about his life. And she was a fourth grader. And it was clear to me that as a college graduate, I knew much less about this man's life than my little students there on the west side of the city. I learned that Dr. King actually had lived just a few blocks from the school where I was teaching. Towards the end of his life, he became part of the Poor People's Movement. After the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1964, he became part of the Poor People's Movement, and his work in the city was just blocks away from the school where I was teaching.
I remember the day he died and how devastating that was to my dad. I think our family kind of related to him because my dad and Dr. King were just about 3 years apart in age. They were both pastors. Both pastors' family had kids about the same age, and it seemed like it was somebody we could really relate to. And so when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, which I've listened to countless times, when I first heard it, I was probably about 8. because I was alive then. But the statement that always got to me was when he talked about his 4 children and that he didn't want us to judge them by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
A big thing is, so, my parents are mixed. My dad's Hispanic, my mom's white. If it hadn't been for MLK and others like him who were fighting for racial recognition, I wouldn't be here because my parents wouldn't have been married. So that's kind of a big deal, I guess, for me as well.
The impact that he's had on my life is just taking the time that we've been given and bringing action to it. In the same letter, he kind of talks about how it's so easy to assume that time heals, but time is neutral. And if we're not using the time that we've been given, then the time is a waste of time. And so I think especially now, we know the issues that are happening and we need to move forward with it. And I think he definitely taught all of us that we need to speak out about the things we believe in.
I think we should remember Dr. King, we should honor him and celebrate him. But most of all, Dr. King stood for service. And I would like to read a quote from Dr. King. Dr. King uttered these words: "Everyone can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love." So this is why Martin Luther King Day is important to me, to serve.
His witness as a Christian man is you can't miss it. You can't miss his witness as a Christian man. His life of service to the African American people and the poor people of this country was a life of service to God. It had nothing to do with self-promotion. He was through and through a minister.
I feel somewhat connected because my great-grandmother was from Selma, and that's when that's where he was like stationed, pretty much did everything. And I had family members who are a part of the Bloody Sunday event that happened in 1965. So I feel somewhat connected because of that. My great-grandmother went to a lot of the rallies and movements that happened.
During his march, there was people who were wanting to riot. And one of the big things he said is that, no, we're not going to riot. And that kind of really sticks out to me because it shows, not only the self-control that he had and the message that he was really wanting to portray and was willing to go, despite, the anger and the frustration that was going on, he was willing to stay calm under all that. It's an example that we too can do that as well, despite the challenges and the difficulties that we're facing.
And I have appreciated, again, his grounding of justice in a biblical call for justice, his call to love, to not hate, and to fight injustice through nonviolent protest. I said to somebody last summer, I'm longing for a statesman like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. this year. I wish he were still here.
There were so many things that he said that I didn't understand. Even as I've listened to it again, I realized there were greater issues out there that I was not aware of. I lived in a small town in Michigan, but I always related to what he said about his kids. And so I've tried for my whole life to do that, to never be judgmental of somebody because of their skin color, and I've tried to embrace them. My mom was a teacher, and she went back to school and actually started teaching just a couple of years after Dr. King's death. But she taught in a school where there were black students and white students. She loved kindergarten because she wanted to teach everybody to read. And she modeled for me what Dr. King said. So that has the greatest impact on my life.
So when I evaluate my life as a senior and the call that God has given me as a pastor, and the fear that comes with, sometimes sharing the gospel to people that you don't know, what they might think, what they might say, I could reflect on Dr. King, and regardless of the color of my skin, I could go out there and represent Jesus Christ.